The wedding planner dropped the folder onto the marble table, and the room went silent. "Sign here," she said. "Once you approve the transfer, the lake house will officially become the wedding venue." I stared at the document in front of me. My son's fiancée, Claire, sat across the room wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my first car. She smiled like she had already won. Then she noticed the envelope in my hand. Her smile disappeared. "Wait," she whispered. I slowly placed the envelope beside the contract. "I'm sorry, Claire," I said calmly. "There won't be a wedding at my lake house." The room froze. My son Daniel looked at me like he had never seen me before. "Mom, what did you do?" I looked through the glass doors toward the lake that had belonged to my family for 3 generations. "I sold the water rights this morning." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. Before we continue, I want to thank everyone who has been listening to these stories and supporting this channel. If you are returning, welcome back. Your support means more than you know. And if this is your first time here, make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss another emotional story. Also, tell me in the comments where you are listening from. I would love to know how far this story reaches. Now, let me take you back to how everything fell apart. My name is Margaret Hayes, and for 32 years, I believed the greatest achievement of my life was not the businesses I helped build or the money I saved. It was raising my son. After my husband passed away when Daniel was only 12, I became both parents. I worked 2 jobs, skipped vacations, and rebuilt our lives one difficult day at a time. The lake house was my husband's dream. He bought the small piece of land beside Clearwater Lake before Daniel was born. Over the years, we repaired it, expanded it, and filled every corner with memories. The old wooden dock where Daniel caught his first fish. The kitchen, where my husband taught him how to make pancakes. The bedroom upstairs, where Daniel would hide during thunderstorms because he was convinced lightning could break through the roof. That house was never just property, it was our history. When Daniel introduced Claire, I wanted to love her. At first, she was charming. She held my hands and told me how lucky Daniel was to have a mother who sacrificed so much for him. But slowly, things changed. The compliments became demands. The questions became expectations, and the expectations became entitlement. The first warning sign came when Claire casually mentioned their wedding plans. "We were thinking of something intimate," she said over dinner. I smiled. "That sounds beautiful." Then she added, "At your lake house, of course." I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. "Oh, Margaret," she said, waving her hand. "It makes sense. The property is perfect. The view, the space, the history. Everyone will love it." I looked at Daniel, expecting him to correct her. He simply looked down at his plate. That hurt more than Claire's words. A few weeks later, she arrived with a wedding planner, photographers, and a stack of papers. No invitation, no conversation, just a decision that had already been made. "This will be the ceremony area," the planner said, pointing toward the garden where my husband's ashes were scattered. I felt my stomach tighten. "Excuse me?" Claire looked confused. "The garden?" she asked. "Oh, yes. We thought we'd clear some of those old plants. The space would look much better for photographs." My hand gripped the edge of the table. Those plants were not decorations. My husband planted them himself. But before I could speak, Daniel interrupted. "Mom, don't make this difficult." Those 5 words broke something inside me. Not because he disagreed, because he sounded embarrassed by me. I looked at my son, the boy I protected, the man I raised, and wondered when I became an inconvenience in his perfect future. That night, I walked through every room of the lake house alone. I touched the old photographs on the walls. I held the fishing medal Daniel won when he was 9. I opened the drawer, where I kept my husband's final handwritten note. And that was when I remembered something I had buried years ago. A conversation my husband had with me before he died. "Margaret," he had said, "never let anyone convince you that kindness means surrendering everything you built." At the time, I thought he was talking about business. I was wrong. The next morning, I called my attorney. Not because I wanted revenge, not yet, because I needed answers. When he arrived, he brought a file I had never seen before. "Margaret," he said quietly, placing the folder on the table. "There is something about this property you were never told." I opened the folder. Inside was an old agreement signed decades earlier, and at the bottom of the page was a clause that changed everything. My husband had planned for this moment long before any of us knew we would need it. I looked back at the lake through the window. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel powerless. I felt prepared, but I still didn't know the hardest part was yet to come, because Claire wasn't just trying to take my lake house. She was hiding the real reason she wanted it, and I was about to discover the secret that would change my entire family forever. The first thing I noticed was that my attorney, Thomas, looked nervous. I had known Thomas Reed for almost 20 years. He had handled my husband's estate, helped me with business contracts, and guided me through some of the hardest moments of my life. But I had never seen him hesitate before opening a file. "Margaret," he said, sitting across from me, "before I explain this, I need you to understand something." I looked at the old documents spread across the table. "What?" "Your husband was not just protecting the lake house." His words made my heart stop. "What are you talking about?" Thomas opened the first page. This property contained something far more valuable than the house itself. I leaned closer. At the top of the document were words I had never seen before. Clearwater Lake Preservation Agreement. For years, I believed the lake house was simply a family retreat. A beautiful piece of land my husband worked hard to purchase, but according to the documents, decades earlier, my husband had entered into an agreement with several neighboring landowners to preserve the lake's natural resources. The agreement included something I never knew existed: water rights. My eyes moved across the page. "This can't be right," I whispered. Thomas nodded. "It is. Why didn't my husband tell me?" Thomas looked away for a moment. "Because he believed you would never need to use it." That sentence stayed with me. My husband knew me too well. He knew I avoided conflict. He knew I forgave people too quickly. He knew I would rather lose something myself than hurt someone else. But he also knew there was a difference between kindness and allowing people to destroy what mattered. I closed the folder. "So Claire knew about this?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. That was my answer. "She didn't just want the lake house for a wedding," he finally said. A cold feeling moved through me. "What did she want?" Thomas pulled out another document. This. It was a development proposal, a luxury resort project, and Claire's name was on it. My hands started shaking. The wedding wasn't the dream. The wedding was the excuse. Claire had been planning something much bigger. She wanted access to the property because of the lake. The same lake my husband spent his life protecting. The same lake where Daniel learned to swim. The same lake where I scattered my husband's ashes. I felt something inside me change. For weeks, I had been hurt because I thought my son's fiancée simply didn't respect my memories. But this was different. This was calculated. "She planned to sell the rights?" I asked. Thomas nodded. "Her investors believe Clearwater Lake could become one of the most profitable private developments in the state." I stared at the papers. "How much?" Thomas paused. "Enough that someone would be willing to hide their true intentions." I thought about Claire's sweet voice, her fake hugs, her constant compliments, the way she called me Mom, even though she barely knew me. Suddenly, every conversation felt different. Every smile felt rehearsed. Then Thomas handed me one more envelope. "This was found attached to your husband's original agreement." My name was written on the front, in my husband's handwriting. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single page, only a few sentences, but they felt like he was sitting across from me. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then someone has tried to convince you that what we built is worth less than what they can gain from it." I swallowed hard. "Do not fight with anger. Fight with truth. The person who underestimates you will eventually reveal themselves." I closed my eyes. My husband wasn't telling me to destroy anyone. He was telling me to stand up. That afternoon, I called Daniel. I wanted to believe there was still a chance. Maybe Claire had manipulated him. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe my son was still the boy who used to sit beside me on that dock and tell me I was his hero. He answered after 3 rings. "Mom? Daniel, we need to talk." A pause. "About the wedding?" No. About Claire's real plans. The silence on the other end told me everything. You know, I whispered. Mom, please. My heart sank. You knew? I didn't think it was a big deal. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A big deal? Mom, it's just land. I looked around the room. The photographs, the memories, the life my husband and I built. Just land? Daniel sighed. You have to understand. Claire has connections. This opportunity could change our lives. There it was. The truth. Not anger, not regret. Just ambition. My own son was willing to sacrifice my legacy because someone promised him a better future. Daniel, I said quietly, did she tell you what would happen to this place? He didn't answer. That silence hurt more than any confession. Before he hung up, he said something I would never forget. Mom, don't make enemies over a house. I stared at the phone after the call ended. Because Daniel still didn't understand. This was never about a house. It was about trust. It was about betrayal. And it was about someone believing that because I was quiet, I was weak. The next morning, I made my first move. I signed the documents, but I didn't sell the house. I did something Claire never expected. I transferred the water rights. Not to her, not to investors, to a conservation organization that would protect Clearwater Lake forever. The moment the paperwork was completed, I knew Claire would come after me. And she did. That evening, my front gate opened. A black SUV drove up the driveway. Claire stepped out, but she wasn't smiling anymore. She walked toward my door holding a folder. Behind her were two lawyers.
Margaret,
She said coldly, I think you made a mistake. I looked at the lawyers. Then at the folder in her hands. What kind of mistake? She smiled. The same fake smile she had worn for months. The kind that could cost you everything. She opened the folder. And when I saw the document inside, I realized Claire had been preparing for this battle long before I discovered her secret. She wasn't just trying to take my lake, she was trying to take my entire future. Claire stood in my doorway with two lawyers behind her, and a confidence I had never seen before. She looked around the lake house as if she was already imagining it belonging to her. The same house where I had raised my son. The same house where my husband's final memories lived. The same house she tried to steal while pretending she was becoming part of our family. Margaret, she said, holding up the folder. I really hoped we wouldn't have to do this. I looked at the lawyers, then back at her. Do what? She opened the folder slowly. Inside was a lawsuit against me. My own son's fiancée was trying to claim that I had interfered with a business opportunity and caused financial damage to her investors. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. You're suing me! Claire tilted her head. I'm giving you an opportunity to fix your mistake. There it was. She wasn't angry, she wasn't hurt. She was negotiating, as if my memories were a business deal, as if my husband's promise was just an obstacle. What mistake? You transferred the water rights without telling anyone involved in the wedding plans. I stared at her. The wedding plans? She smiled. The development plans. For the first time, she admitted it. Not directly, but enough. The wedding was never about love. It was about access. It was about using my family's property to open a door for her investors. I looked at the lawyers. Do they know what you actually planned? The younger lawyer looked uncomfortable. The older one avoided my eyes. That told me everything. Claire noticed. Her expression hardened. Don't try to turn people against me. I stepped aside and allowed them inside. Come in. Claire seemed surprised. She expected fear. She expected panic. She expected the woman who always apologized. But that woman was gone. The lawyers sat at my dining table. The same table where Daniel had done his homework as a child. The same table where my husband and I celebrated every birthday. Claire placed the lawsuit in front of me. You have 48 hours to reverse the transfer. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at her. No. Her smile disappeared. Excuse me? I said no. The room became quiet. You don't understand what you're risking. I nodded. I understand perfectly. No, Margaret, you don't. She leaned forward. You're an older woman holding on to sentimental things. This project could create jobs. It could create wealth. You're standing in the way of progress. I looked out toward the lake. then back at her. Funny. What? My husband said something similar years ago. Claire frowned. What? He said people who want something badly enough will always find a way to make greed sound like progress. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Claire stood. You're making a huge mistake. No. I looked directly at her. You made the mistake. She walked away without another word. But I knew the fight was only beginning, and I was right. The next morning, rumors started spreading through town. Claire's version of the story traveled faster than the truth. She told people I was bitter. She told them I was angry about losing control. She told them I was trying to ruin Daniel's future because I didn't approve of his marriage. And the worst part? Some people believed her. At the grocery store, neighbors who had known me for decades suddenly became quiet when I walked by. At church, people who once hugged me looked away. It felt like the humiliation was happening all over again. Just like the day Claire's wedding planner walked through my house as if I wasn't there. But then something unexpected happened. Someone knocked on my door. It was Linda, Claire's former assistant. I barely recognized her. She looked exhausted. Margaret, she whispered. I need to talk to you. I invited her inside. She kept looking toward the windows, as if someone might be watching. What happened? Linda took a deep breath. I worked for Claire for 3 years. I waited. She's not who everyone thinks she is. I said nothing, because I already knew. But I needed proof. Linda reached into her bag and pulled out a small flash drive. She doesn't know I have this. My heart started beating faster. What is it? Everything. I looked at the small device sitting in her hand. Everything? Linda nodded. The investors. The fake wedding budget. The conversations about buying you out. The plan to pressure Daniel into convincing you. I stared at her. Why are you helping me? She looked down. Because I should have spoken up sooner. I remembered something. Months earlier, when Claire had brought her to the lake house, Linda had quietly complimented my husband's garden. She was the only person who seemed to notice the meaning behind it. You tried to warn me, I said. She nodded, but nobody listened. I took the flash drive, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. That night, I opened the files. There were emails, financial records, messages, and then I found something that made my hands go cold. A conversation between Claire and Daniel. It was dated 6 months before their engagement, before the wedding plans, before Claire ever pretended to love our family. I read the message again, then again, because I wanted to believe I misunderstood, but I didn't. Claire wrote, "Once we get Margaret to transfer control, the rest will be easy. Daniel won't choose his mother over his future." I closed my eyes. The betrayal was worse than I imagined. Daniel wasn't just being manipulated. He was part of the plan. The next morning, I had one decision to make. I could take the evidence to court quietly, or I could expose the truth in the place where Claire planned to celebrate her victory, the wedding ceremony, the same event where she expected everyone to applaud her, the same event where she expected me to sit silently in the background. But I had learned something important. Silence protects the person causing the damage, and I was done being silent. I picked up my phone. I called the wedding planner. "Cancel nothing," I said. A pause. "Mrs. Hayes?" "Yes." My voice was calm. "Let the wedding continue." The planner sounded confused. "But why?" I looked at the lake. Because sometimes the best revenge is not stopping someone from walking into their own trap. Sometimes you let them walk all the way in. Because I want everyone to hear the truth. And for the first time in months, I smiled.